Our last topic then talks about the different licenses and license activation models that you really need to be prepared for as you go through implementing this new version of the OS. The likelihood, however, is that in many of these situations, you may have already got the activation model in your environment already, but because there's so much complexity here, because there are so many options, it's worth taking a look here at the different kinds of activation models that Microsoft provides. The first of which is, at face value, the easiest, but honestly the most difficult as you begin to scale your environment and size. This is the use of retail and/or multiple activation keys. Effectively, in this activation model, you have a series of characters, long strings of characters, your actual license code, that you use then to plug directly into each individual machine to activate, or really to license and activate that machine. I call it at the same time the easiest and the hardest because if you just have that list of keys and you know where your mapping is between keys and machines, well, then you just need to plug the right key into the right server and keep an eye out for exactly how many times you've perhaps activated a multiple activation key. Those MAKs, or multiple activation keys, are usually coded with a specific number of activations. But the hard part here is that as you scale, maintaining that list of who goes where becomes really, really complicated. And so Microsoft in the past included a service called the Key Management Service, which was a way to consolidate all those keys into a service that could just operate in the background. That key management service, unfortunately, for a lot of people was a big pain in the neck because of some of the decisions that were made on the part of Microsoft for how it actually would function. KMS always was kind of a challenging service to manage. While it didn't require Active Directory, the machines that were using a KMS server or were activating against it required periodic connectivity with the KMS host to remain activated. This was kind of a problem if you had those users that were out of the office for a very extended period of time, and particularly those people that were in remote sites that perhaps didn't have connectivity to a KMS server. KMS also had this kind of weird problem with this high activation threshold, quote unquote, that when not enough machines were around, I think it was something like 25 machines for desktops and 5 for servers, the KMS server just didn't have enough activations there to actually go through finishing the activation for those machines. So in a very small environment, you may not actually ever get your KMS server to activate those computers. Well, Microsoft has in recent years is trying to replace the KMS service there with a new Active Directory-based activation. You still need to install the Volume Activation Services function there on a domain controller, and it's something I've actually already done here in this environment, so I can show you one of the screens here in just a second. But after you install the Volume Activation Services function there on a domain controller, you just add in your host key, the key that you get from Microsoft, and then the machines in your environment will then be able to just simply activate against Active Directory itself. It is arguable that those machines will have more and better connectivity to your Active Directory infrastructure than would at your key management service and your server there. And so when you're worried about where you're extending this whole infrastructure out to, for example, remote users or remote sites, you're probably going to get them access to Active Directory before you start spreading out multiple KMS servers. Now be aware that in order for Active Directory-based activation to work, the machines that are participating need to have what's called a generic volume license key installed, which for machines right out of the box, usually these machines don't require the separate installation or punching in of that GVLK. Those GVLKs are typically there on those machines by default out of the box. Sometimes they can be adjusted if you've got strange ways in which you're deploying machines. But those that were activated through some other mechanism, like a multiple activation key or a retail key, will need to have that key replaced with these GVLKs, these generic volume license keys. Now, let me show you here just a website that Microsoft does provide that includes those generic volume license keys for each of the versions you may be working with. Right here we have KMS client setup keys, which if I scroll down just a bit, you'll see the list of keys that you would need to plug into a machine if for some reason you used one of the other volume activation methods. These evolve over time as Microsoft adds new versions of the operating system, but if you Google around, you'll eventually find yourself to this location where you can download these GVLKs. They are universal because the assumption is that on your Active Directory-based activation server, you've gone through and punched in the necessary connectivity there to Microsoft in order for that machine and then Active Directory to facilitate doing all the activations from that point on. So this is a much greater way, much superior way in order to accomplish this whole activation of machines. However, be prepared that there are some situations where KMS can still become useful. Active Directory-based activation is designed to replace the KMS server, but it's really only useful for Windows 8 and Windows 2012 and up operating systems. So if you have older versions of the OS, they're not going to work with Active Directory-based activation. You'll need to have a co-located KMS server there as well for those machines. You'll also have to worry about machines that may not be on the Active Directory domain. Any machine that comes out of the Active Directory domain and goes into, for example, a work group will automatically then search around for a KMS server for it to work. Obviously, you need to have Active Directory for Active Directory-based activation to work. And so if you have those other machines that are out of the domain, you may also need a KMS server, and it is still available here in Windows Server 2016 to support those use cases. So Microsoft provides, again, both of these different options here to assist when you want to move away from those retail and multiple activation keys. There is a fourth option here that you use in situations where you've got virtual machines on top of a Hyper-V host called automatic VM activation. This fourth option here is used really to simplify the whole assignment of license keys to those virtual machines on the Hyper-V host. And it really works quite simple in that if you put an AVMA key, an automatic VM activation key, into the virtual machine or all the virtual machines there on top of your hypervisor host, those virtual machines will then use the host's licensing and activation to continue with their own activation on top. And so for this process, really the only thing you need to do is, number one, make sure that your Hyper-V host is activated. And then number two, come right over here to this website for automatic virtual machine activation and ensure that you have the appropriate AVMA key for whatever edition you're working with and also what operating system you're working with as well. So punch these into the virtual machine. And again, those virtual machines will work with whatever licensing and activation exists on the host on which they're residing.